trains them into doing really bad stuff. And then this person said, I kind of want to write an app that tracks how many hours per week I spend to a FA. This is another really bad thing. If you are wasting your users' time, impacting productivity, the business is going to find ways around that. They are going to start doing shadow IT stuff, and you're going to get yourself into a world of hurt. We did a customer case study with a real Microsoft customer. So this was a European financial company, and they got approval for this. Don't do this in your own environment without approval. But their red team basically staged a password spray attack on their own users. If you do this using a password dictionary, you're pretty likely to get a couple users in your environment at least. And once they compromised a few of the users' passwords, the next thing they did was they sprayed those users with MFA prompts. So there were some interesting results from this. One was nobody reported anything. There were no calls to the help desk to report that there was too much prompting. That's really bad. Many users approved the MFA requests, so they realized they had a big problem with users just approving anything. And then one user actually uninstalled the Authenticator app, so it's not really clear how they were doing their job at that point. So you don't want to be in this situation. So overprompting leads to compromise. Microsoft has data that actually backs this up. Customers fight us on it all the time, but it is true, I swear. It trains users into learning bad behaviors, like just approving any old MFA prompt. It also impacts productivity, especially on platforms without SSO, and I'll talk about that more in a little bit. And this is especially common on macOS. macOS does support SSO with Azure AD, I'm going to talk about it, but it doesn't do it out of the box. So if you have not done something to get your device into an SSO state with Azure AD, there's a pretty good chance you're prompting your Mac users too much. We want to strive to improve user experience and security. These things are not mutually exclusive, they go hand in hand. So we want to prompt when needed, new device, new location, a change in the state of the user. These are the appropriate times to prompt. It's not just every morning because security thought that was a good idea. And if you do need a prompt, I would recommend trying to use passwordless credentials to make it less user impactful when it is needed. So let's talk about the top 5 recommendations for the Mac environment specifically. So number 1, determine if you have a prompting problem. There's actually data in Azure AD that will help you figure this out. So all the data you need is in your Azure AD sign-in logs. They have all the information on how much you're prompting your users by every OS platform is in there. And we actually pre-built a workbook for you to help you figure this out. So if you export your logs to Azure Monitor, you can use this workbook, and it's just right there out of the box at aka.ms/MFA prompts workbook. And this will show you, using your own data, what sort of prompting you're doing in your environment. So we have pre-built visualizations and all sorts of information on things like which users are being prompted the most. Maybe you have an issue where a user is using an unmanaged device, or which applications have a high prompt count. We have seen cases where customers have configured SaaS applications incorrectly, and the SaaS app told Azure AD, prompt me a bunch. And then what's the state of the user's device? You can see in the example that we have here from one of our lab environments that 95% of the sign-ins were on unmanaged devices. That tells us that we're doing a bad job of managing the hardware in that environment and probably not deploying SSO to our endpoints. So number 1, prove it with data. Number 2, enroll your Macs into MDM. This seems really obvious since we're at a conference that's mostly about like an MDM, but enroll your devices into MDM and use device compliance. MDM is the only modern way to deploy some of the new SSO features in macOS, so if you're not doing MDM management yet, you need to start moving in that direction. It helps us improve device identity and security through things like SSO and through things like conditional access, so we can improve on both of those points. One thing I really want to hammer home is that in the Azure AD world, supporting conditional access via either using Intune or using Intune Partner MDM and deploying SSO are 2 separate but related features. You need MDM for both, but you don't have to do both of them if you don't want. So if you just want the SSO piece and you don't care about conditional access, that's fine, you can deploy SSO. If you just want the conditional access piece and you don't care about SSO for some crazy reason, you can do that too. Related but different. This is a cause for a lot of confusion sometimes. But it is really, really critical to get that compliance information into Azure AD. If Azure AD doesn't know about the MDM managed state of the device, it's going to look unmanaged, and therefore your strictest policies are going to tend to apply. If you don't want to use Intune, which works really easily out of the box, we do have a bunch of compliance partners. Jamf Pro is a big one for the Mac community, but there are others. So again, without Intune or an Intune integrated MDM, Azure AD sees all Macs as unmanaged. So that's a really important point to remember. So if you are using Intune, this is basically what it looks like, a really simplified version. The end user device is under Intune management, and Intune sending the compliance state to the Intune service or Microsoft Endpoint Manager. I forgot to change the title. And then the important part here is the Intune service sends a calculated state to Azure AD. So Azure AD has a device object, and there's just a binary value on it that says compliant, not compliant, and that's it. And then when the user signs in, Azure AD checks that, and we can make decisions based on that. If you use a different MDM, you can do that, and it works very similarly, where instead the device will be managed by the Microsoft MDM partner. So Jamf Pro would be the really common one that I run into in the Mac world. And the same thing applies, where compliance state can be sent to the Intune service, and the Intune service does the same thing. It writes into Azure AD. From Azure AD's perspective, everything comes through the Intune service. So there's a little extra work to get your Jamf Pro environment set up to integrate with Microsoft Endpoint Manager and Intune, but generally we think it's probably worth it if you care about zero trust and a good user experience. Number 3, set up your SSO infrastructure. So macOS can provide SSO in a few different ways. So one, the old school way, is Kerberos bind. So this would be like joining a Mac to an on-prem Active Directory environment. Apple's been telling people to move away from this. So if you're still doing this, you should start thinking about the future. Another way would be using something like Apple's Kerberos SSO extension. A key point about this is that it has to be deployed through the MDM channel. So you can see MDM is becoming more and more important. This is still designed for on-premises directory services, though not really designed for the cloud. Kerberos is pretty old school. There's other things that kind of fall into this category, like Jamf Connect would be like a more advanced solution that can do some very similar things. And then the third option would be Modern Auth. So this would be token-based SSO. And for this, you need an IDP vendor who has made a plugin for Apple's SSO framework. And so that's us, Microsoft. We have built one. Other vendors can build their own. But we have chosen to build one, and specifically, it is the redirect type. So there's actually 2 different types that Apple supports. And so I'm going to mostly focus on the redirect type. So let's talk about Kerberos really quickly and why it's so bad. It's not bad, why we don't want to do it anymore. All right, so with Kerberos, the user's on their Mac and they need to sign in. If you're syncing passwords, they might provide their corporate username and password with their Active Directory credentials at the lock screen. Otherwise, maybe they sign in with a local account and then they're prompted after they sign in to provide username and password. It's almost always just username and password. Active Directory really only understands passwords and certificates, and that's basically it. So when this happens, the device sends the credentials to Active Directory, and Active Directory returns something called a TGT. This is like a super simplified version of Kerberos, so if anybody's a Kerberos expert, I apologize. Active Directory validates the credits and returns that TGT. The user tries to access an app. So this could be in their browser, it could be in another app, it could be like a print server, file server, web server, something that's integrated with Active Directory for Kerberos. And they're told by the application, you need a Kerberos ticket. So macOS uses that TGT and it asks Active Directory for a ticket specific to the application. If everything's good, Active Directory returns that ticket. This is called a TGS. And then the client application on the device can send the TGS to the Kerberos app. So this is single sign-on in the sense that the user has not had to provide their credentials more than once. They sign into the device or sign into the Kerberos extension using the credentials one time, and then this TGT can be used to get what they need in order to get into other applications. So it provides a good user experience. So there are some issues with this story, and a big one has to do with the internet. This doesn't really work over the internet, so it is not very modern. So remember, we're all using like SaaS applications every day, and a lot of times we're not getting on VPNs anymore. So this is not the best way to do this. So imagine we have a SaaS app, like a SAML application or an OpenID Connect application instead. So in this world, where we have a SaaS app, how are we supposed to do single sign-on? Kerberos doesn't really make sense because that SaaS vendor is not going to assume that your device can always see a domain controller. So they're not going to implement Kerberos. And even if they did, without being on the VPN, what does the user do? Maybe they provide credentials to the device tries to find a domain controller and it just utterly fails, and therefore sign-in is broken for their application. So this is not the modern way to handle this. In order to do this in a modern way, we need modern auth. So this is, again, open protocols like SAML, OpenID Connect, OAuth 2, web-based protocols. And the big advantages of web-based protocols is their flexibility. So in the case of Azure AD, we can challenge for certificates, we can use all sorts of different forms of MFA, we can do passwordless auth, we can redirect the session through a proxy so that we can download, do an inline proxy that blocks downloads. There's all sorts of stuff you can do if you're using web-based protocols. So we really need a web-based method, a token-based method to provide that SSO experience. So before I get into our implementation, I really quickly want to talk about a couple artifacts that matter for Azure AD. And this goes for pretty much any OS, Windows, iOS, macOS, Android. Again, our goal is prompt once, per user, per device, per password change. We don't want to over-prompt the user all the time. So when your device is in a managed state with Azure AD, you've done all the things you need to do to support SSO, that device is typically going to get something called a primary refresh token. Windows devices get this when they're hybrid Azure AD joined or Azure AD joined. Macs can get this if you use our SSO extension that integrates with Apple's framework. iOS devices can get these, Android, etc. The primary refresh token is specific to that user on that device, and it's used to perform long-term authentication. So it's just like that Kerberos TGT. Then, when the user wants to access applications, they need other artifacts that are specific to the applications, just like the Kerberos TGS. So for Azure AD, this would be a refresh token, access token pair that is specific to the application. So if I try to sign into Exchange Online, connect to my mailbox in Outlook, then I am going to open Outlook, and Outlook is going to go to Azure AD and say, I want a refresh token, access token pair for the Exchange Online cloud service. That refresh token is used to maintain a long-term state. It includes information like was an MFA performed, the IP address where the user was signed in from, things like that. And basically, we keep issuing new refresh tokens until something changes. So this is how we achieve that long-term state for the end user. The access token is super short-lived. This is only good for about an hour typically. And this has to be short-lived because this is what the user presents to the application to identify themselves. The application validates it and lets them in. So when I say we need to challenge our user constantly to refresh their session, this is the artifact that we're reissuing on a constant basis in order to do so. So in the Azure AD world, there's a few things that you need, or in the modern auth world, there's a few things you need. You need an IDP that supports web standards, so we got one of those. There's plenty of others on the market. That IDP needs applications integrated with it. The IDP vendor has to create one of these SSO extension plugins. So Microsoft's done it, other vendors are doing it or have done it. You need your maps under MDM management. So again, MDM is a requirement. And then you need to do one other thing, which is put our software on the device. So today, this is the Intune Company portal. Intune Company portal is used to do Intune enrollment, but it can also be used to deploy SSO. And these are, again, mutually exclusive. So if you put the company portal on the device, but you use a different MDM, you can have the company portal there just to do the SSO piece. And so just like before, we have the user authenticate. There's many more authentication options, like again, passwordless, different forms of MFA. This is all web-based, so we have a lot of flexibility here. And then the SSO extension uses those credentials to go get a PRT from Azure AD, so just like we did with the TGT before. Again, PRTs are good for 14 days by default, so as long as the user is using their device pretty frequently, we won't ask them for credentials again. Now, there's actually two different flows for applications to integrate with our SSO broker built into Company Portal. And we're going to start with one called the MSAL flow. MSAL just means Microsoft Authentication Library. Anybody can use this, it's open source. You can grab it and put it in your app, and it makes integrating with Azure AD really easy. So, if an app uses MSAL, it goes and talks directly to our SSO broker, because our auth library knows how to talk to our broker, and say, I want tokens. The SSO broker sends its PRT to Azure AD and says, give me tokens. Azure AD evaluates all those conditional access policies we talked about, and if nothing's changed, we give them back their tokens. The token is sent to the application, and the user is connected up. So if they open Outlook and the SSO extension is present, they should generally just get connected up, no prompts. There's a different flow that we call the redirect flow. And this one's really interesting because it works for apps that are not using Microsoft software. So Safari is a really good example. Apple built Safari, they're not going to use Microsoft Auth Library. So the way that it works for this one is very similar. Instead, the user opens Safari and tries to go to portal.office.com or a SharePoint site or other app, whatever it is. And that app in the cloud says, I need a token from Azure AD. So go to login.microsoftonline.com and get one. At that point, the macOS network stack actually intercepts that call and sends it to the broker. So this is the special sauce Apple built into the OS. And then the same thing happens as before, where we use the PRT to request tokens. If everything's good, our tokens are returned, passed through to the application, and we're all good. And the user gets signed in. So this allows us to provide SSO in non-Microsoft applications as well. So Safari, other apps on the device. This is really easy to deploy if Intune's your MDM because we pre-set up a profile for you. So if you use Intune, just go choose Microsoft Azure AD as the SSO extension type. If you use Jamf Pro, we did write a Jamf Pro specific guide because in talking to customers, a lot of them were struggling to get the settings quite right. So we wrote a guide that has all the instructions that you need to do a Jamf Pro deployment at aka.ms/Apple SSO-Jamf Pro. It's a little bit more work because we're not pre-setting any of the settings, but all in all, not too difficult. And if you follow our config guide, I know this is important for some customers. If you follow our config guide, the user never needs to open the Company Portal application. Especially if you don't use Intune as your MDM, you might not want your users actually opening Company Portal. So if you follow our recommended settings, the SSO broker can actually be provisioned in a different application. So here, I opened a Safari window and tried to go to portal.office.com, and I was prompted in this little frame to authenticate, and that is the SSO extension from Company Portal at work. So the user can authenticate there, provision that PRT, never had to open Company Portal, never had to touch it. I do recommend, just to reiterate, Company Portal does have to be there though. It's the thing that knows how to do the PRT. So if you don't use Intune as your MDM, that's totally fine. You don't need to do the Intune and Jamf Pro integration for conditional access. If you don't care about that, that's fine. You can still deploy this SSO stuff. If you are testing, I do highly recommend using Safari. Even in private browsing mode, it will still be redirected to the SSO extension. So that's why I use Safari there. A couple caveats to call out. The Microsoft component to this, our SSO broker, is still in public preview. We're working on like 1 or 2 more bugs before we declare GA. So we're still working on that. It is fully supported though, so you can call Microsoft support if you run into an issue. Apps do need to use MSAL or Apple's system frameworks for those network requests. That means that if some apps don't use those things, then they're not going to participate in SSO. The big one that I've heard from customers so far is Chrome and Firefox. I've heard Firefox maybe is doing something, I'm not 100% sure. Chrome, I really don't know. So if you deploy this and it's not working in Chrome, don't be surprised. We don't have any fix for it today. So Safari and Microsoft Edge, because we're putting our auth library in Microsoft Edge, those two will work. If you have other app vendors where the SSO extension is not working, please talk to those app vendors or come talk to me. I'll try to go talk to those app vendors. We want to try to get as many app vendors to support this as possible because Apple is only making these types of extensions more important as time goes on. And then another thing is that if you are using passwordless auth methods, you cannot use FIDO keys to provision the user account in the SSO extension today. It's just a limitation with the Apple operating system. So we do recommend that Mac users use Authenticator app, which I am now going to talk about, because we recommend that, as recommendation number 4, that you start moving towards passwordless auth. And for Mac users, a really good option there is the Authenticator app from Microsoft. So passwordless in general provides the best user experience plus best security. In fact, Mark and I have been part of a pilot at Microsoft for over 2 years. I don't know what my Microsoft password is. I haven't used it in 2 years. I don't ever really use it. I just sign in with passwordless auth all the time. This truly works. Also, any application you integrate with Azure AD will benefit from this, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So if you're using Windows devices, it's really easy, like you do Windows Hello for Business, or you do FIDO key sign-in. If you're using FIDO keys, it is possible to use them on Macs. They just work in Edge and Chrome today. We're still working on Safari support, a couple things to be done there. But the one universal passwordless auth method that works pretty much everywhere is Authenticator app. So Authenticator app does have a passwordless mode where users can sign into things using just Authenticator app and never have to provide a password. Would highly recommend exploring the use of that for your Mac users. There's also the emerging passkey standard. We don't have support for it in Azure AD quite yet, so give us a little bit more time. But passkeys are a new type of FIDO credential that is going to be something that's integrated more into the OS itself rather than relying on something like an app distributed by Microsoft. Recommendation number 5, SSO all the things. All the work you do in numbers 1 through 4 does not matter very much if you don't really have Azure AD integrated with any of your applications, or whatever your IDP of choice is at their SSO extension. So for us, we want to make sure that our customers can get the benefit of these things for as many applications as possible. I talked a lot about modern auth applications, but we can also publish other apps, like on-premise legacy Kerberos apps. You can put Azure AD in front of those using our app proxy tool. There are password-based applications. We have integrations with third parties like F5 and Akamai. And it's really important that customers understand that this is a reality that can be achieved today. You want to move your applications to your cloud IDP so that you can get the benefits of these types of technologies. Like our SSO extension is never going to really do much for your Kerberos applications if they linger there. Microsoft, we did this ourselves. We're an Azure AD customer. Microsoft IT is an Azure AD customer, just like a lot of others are. And we moved about 18,000 applications off of ADFS onto our Azure AD tenant. And that is why Mark and I can go about our lives for years on end without using passwords, because we have invested the time and effort into moving these applications. We do try to make this easy for you. So if you think that this sounds like a lot of work, we've tried to make it a little bit simpler. We have an app gallery, there's lots of applications in there. My main ask is that if you start working on integrating your Mac applications and you're finding that some of the Mac SaaS services you use don't show up in our gallery, you can reach out to us. We have a link, aka.ms/AAD app gallery request, which is a big mouthful. If you go to that link, you can request that Microsoft reach out to the app vendor and try to work with that app vendor to get them onboarded to this. We'll do the work for you. So please let us know if you run into applications where this is where they're not available in our app gallery. And one of the other reasons you want to bring all these applications into your cloud IDP for SSO, like Azure AD, like bringing them into Azure AD, is that there is a lot in these types of solutions beyond just signing users in and maybe doing some MFA. We have things like governance for applications, where you can have request workflows for users to get onboarded to apps, automatically synchronize users out to other applications via skin connectors, remove access using things like access reviews. There's a ton of functionality in cloud IDPs today. So if you are still doing all of your provisioning into applications on-prem, your app integration on-prem, you're really losing out on a lot of value. In fact, value that you might already be paying for. There's also new features coming to the cloud all the time. Ignite's next month. We'll probably have some stuff to announce. The cloud continues to evolve. There's lots of exciting stuff in the cloud that is just never going to come to on-prem. So move your applications, try to get them to benefit from these cloud-delivered features, including Apple's modern SSO extension framework. And with that, I want to talk about 5 go-dos to recap, and then we can hopefully do a little bit of Q&A. So number 1, work with your identity and security team. If you're not on those teams, if you're on device management instead, work with the IAM and security teams to improve the end user experience. Figure out what data, like are you looking at the logs and the data that you have in your environment, and are you using that data to figure out what sort of investments you should be making to improve things. Set device compliance via Intune or an Intune integrated MDM. I know a lot of Mac shops really love Jamf Pro, and that's totally awesome. Integrate that Jamf Pro environment with Endpoint Manager so that we can use the state of those Jamf managed Macs in conditional access. Number 3, regardless of whether or not you do, number 2, you should be deploying SSO to your endpoints. If you use Office 365, if you use Azure AD, you should deploy the Azure AD Enterprise SSO plugin, or you should at least pilot it if you're not allowed to deploy it until we go GA. I do have a lot of customers who are now actively deploying, so it is definitely doable in production. Please start looking at deploying this, not just for macOS, but actually for iOS as well. Everything I talked about with the PRT also applies to iOS. Nudge your users to start using passwordless authentication. So when we do need to interrupt the user with an auth prompt, we make it as painless as possible. And finally, get your applications modernized. Bring your modern auth applications to your identity team, get those applications integrated into that IDP, move away from those on-prem Kerberos and LDAP applications. With that, thank you. These slides are up on my GitHub if anybody wants to grab a PDF of them at aka.ms/AAD-JNUT2022. And with that, I think we can have a couple questions. This works for both. It really doesn't matter if the user is hybrid. This will work regardless of whether or not the user got sick of the on-prem or not.
Okay, thank you.
Will it be possible to enforce password authentication from the Azure console in the future?
Will it be possible to enforce passwordless auth? Yes. Talk anymore?
Is there a possibility to maintain multiple profiles with SSO?
Multiple profiles in the SSO extension?
Correct.
There is on iOS, there is not on macOS, although we've heard the feature requests, so we're thinking about it.
let's get it.